He bought her for £70,000. That was the sum her father owed, and that was the exact price of a duke's wedding ring. There was no romance, no stolen glances across a crowded ballroom, just a signature on a piece of parchment and a carriage ride into the cold, damp English countryside. This is the story of a marriage built on a ledger, a wedding night heavy with dread, and the 4 words that changed everything. May I continue? The wedding dress was beautiful, provided one didn't have to wear it. Clara Danvers found it heavy. The ivory silk felt less like a garment and more like armor, stiff and unyielding against her ribs. The corset bit into her skin with every shallow breath she took. She stood in the vestibule of St. George's, staring at the heavy oak doors that separated her from the altar. She didn't cry. Clara was 24, an age that society deemed dangerously close to obsolescence, and she had long ago discarded the romantic illusions of her youth. Love was a luxury for those who could afford it. The Danvers family could not. Her father, Lord Richard Danvers, was a man of extravagant tastes and terrible luck. The gaming hells of London had eaten his estate, his investments, and finally, his daughter's future. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Ashbourne, had stepped in, not out of charity, but out of cold, hard pragmatism. He required a wife of good blood to quiet the murmurs of his dying mother, and he required one who would not expect poetry or passion. He bought Clara's hand by erasing her father's debts. It was a clean transaction. The heavy doors opened. A cold draught swept through the stone corridor, making the candles flicker and hiss. Clara walked down the aisle. The church was mostly empty. Arthur had not wanted a spectacle, and Clara's father was too ashamed to invite his peers to witness the completion of his sale. Arthur stood at the altar. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, dressed in a severely cut dark coat. He didn't look like a fairy tale prince. He looked like a man who managed vast tracts of land and hundreds of tenants. His face was angular, his jaw rigid, his dark hair swept back with strict precision. As she reached him, he turned his head. His eyes met hers. They were pale gray, the color of a winter sky just before its first snow. There was no warmth in them, but there was no cruelty either. It was the look of a man inspecting the foundation of a house he was about to purchase. "Miss Danvers," he murmured. His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges. "Your Grace," she replied. The vicar began. The words washed over Clara, meaningless and hollow. To have and to hold, for richer, for poorer. She nearly scoffed at that. The poorer part had been entirely on her end. When Arthur slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was brief. His skin was warm, his calluses catching slightly on her smooth knuckles. It was over in a matter of minutes. They signed the registry. The ink was barely dry before they were walking back down the aisle, stepping out into the grey, spitting rain of a London afternoon. There was no wedding breakfast, no toasts, just a black carriage waiting at the curb, its matched bays stamping impatiently on the wet cobblestones. Her father offered a weak smile, his eyes darting away from hers. "You'll be well taken care of, Clara. He is a good man, a wealthy man." "Goodbye, father," she said flatly. She gathered her skirts and let the footman assist her into the carriage. Arthur followed, the carriage dipping slightly under his weight. The door slammed shut. The lock clicked. It sounded incredibly final. The carriage lurched forward. Clara sat on the velvet bench, staring out the window at the blurred, passing city. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, thick enough to choke on. She could hear the rain drumming against the roof, the squeak of the leather suspension, the rhythmic clink of the horse's harness. She dared a glance at her new husband. Arthur was not looking at her. He had opened a small leather portfolio and was reviewing what looked to be architectural plans, a pencil held loosely in his large hand. He had married her less than an hour ago, and he was already back to work. Clara felt a sudden, sharp prick of annoyance, followed immediately by relief. If he ignored her, she could survive this. She turned her face back to the glass, watching London fade into the rolling, desolate countryside. She was no longer a person. She was a duchess. She was property. They rode for hours. When the light finally began to fail, bleeding away into a bruised purple twilight, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a private gravel drive. Clara pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass. Through the skeletal branches of ancient oaks, Ashbourne Hall came into view. It was massive. It wasn't one of the delicate, symmetrical Palladian villas popular in the south. It was a sprawling, muscular structure of dark stone, looking more like a fortress built to withstand a siege than a home. "It is draughty," Arthur said suddenly. Clara jumped, startled by his voice. It was the first time he had spoken since they'd left London. He was looking at her, his expression unreadable in the dim interior. "The eastern wing is particularly cold. I have instructed Mrs. Croft to put you in the southern chambers. They catch whatever sun we manage to get here." "Thank you," she managed to say. Her throat felt dry. The carriage halted. Footmen appeared with lanterns, throwing long, erratic shadows across the gravel. Arthur stepped out first, ignoring the footman's offered hand, and turned back. He extended his own hand to Clara. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her fingers in his. His grip was firm, steadying her as she stepped down. The wind immediately bit through her traveling cloak, smelling of wet earth and impending frost. The doors of Ashbourne Hall stood open. A line of servants waited in the grand entryway, silent and perfectly still. At their head was an older woman with iron-grey hair, pulled back so tightly it looked painful. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the woman said, dipping into a crisp curtsy. Then, to Clara, "And welcome to Ashbourne, Your Grace." "Thank you, Mrs. Croft," Arthur said, shedding his greatcoat and handing it to a butler. "Take the Duchess to her rooms. She is tired from the journey. We will dine at 8. He didn't ask if she was tired. He simply stated it as a fact, an order given to the household. He offered Clara a brief, stiff nod and walked away, disappearing down the long, dimly lit corridor. Clara was left standing in the cavernous hall, surrounded by strangers. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Croft said. The housekeeper's voice was polite, but entirely devoid of warmth. Clara followed the woman up a grand, sweeping staircase. The house smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and old dust. The southern chambers were indeed large, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in heavy crimson velvet. A fire snapped in the hearth, but it did little to combat the sheer volume of cold air in the room. A young maid named Martha helped Clara out of her traveling clothes and into a simpler evening gown of dark blue wool. Clara sat at the vanity, staring at her reflection as Martha pinned her hair up. She looked pale, exhausted. Dinner was a masterclass in awkwardness. The dining room was 70 feet long. Clara was seated at one end, Arthur at the other. Between them stretched a wasteland of polished mahogany, illuminated by 3 massive silver candelabras. They ate in silence. The clinking of heavy silver cutlery against porcelain echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Clara forced herself to chew the roasted mutton, though it tasted like ash in her mouth. Her stomach was in knots. The wedding night, the thought, hung over the table like an executioner's axe. She knew what was expected of her. She had been raised to understand a woman's duty. Her father had made it abundantly clear before she left. Give him an heir, Clara. That is all he requires. Once that is done, you may live as you please. But the reality of it, the physical reality of submitting to this large, silent stranger sitting 40 feet away, made her hands tremble. She laid her fork down, unable to stomach another bite. Arthur looked up from his plate. The food is not to your liking? The food is fine, Your Grace. I am simply not hungry. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. You should eat. You are too thin. Clara stiffened. The sheer audacity of the critique sparked a sudden, rebellious anger in her chest. She had spent the last 2 years rationing food in her father's house so the servants could eat. I apologize if my appearance displeases you, she said, her voice icy. Perhaps you should have checked the merchandise more thoroughly before finalizing the purchase. The silence that followed was deafening. The footman standing near the sideboard actually stopped breathing. Arthur didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He simply sat back in his chair, his pale grey eyes fixing on hers through the flickering candlelight. For a long moment, he studied her. I didn't buy a prize mare, madam, he said quietly. I married a wife. I merely observed that you look exhausted. You will find that I am a man of plain speaking. I expect you to be the same. He stood up, tossing his napkin onto the table. I will be in my study. I will come to your rooms at 11 o'clock. He turned and walked out. Clara sat entirely still, her heart hammering against her ribs. 11. The schedule was set. The transaction was moving to its final phase. By 10:30, Martha had brushed Clara's hair until it fell in a heavy, dark curtain over her shoulders. She had helped Clara into a nightgown of fine white cotton, modest, practical, but entirely too thin for the chill of the room. Will there be anything else, Your Grace? Martha asked, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. No, Martha, thank you. You may go to bed. The maid curtsied and slipped out the door, the latch clicking shut behind her. Clara was alone. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, shifting shadows across the patterned wallpaper. Clara paced. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet. She felt like a prisoner, waiting for the guard to turn the key. She walked to the window and looked out. The rain had stopped, and a pale, watery moon had broken through the clouds, illuminating the sprawling grounds of the estate. It was beautiful, in a desolate, terrifying way. This was her life now, trapped in a stone box with a man who scheduled his intimacy like a board meeting. She tried to calm her breathing. It will be brief, she told herself. Men like him lack the patience for anything drawn out. Close your eyes. Detach your mind. Let him take what he paid for. A heavy knock sounded at the door. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Come in, she managed to say. It came out as a raspy whisper, but he heard it. The heavy brass handle turned. Arthur stepped into the room. He was not wearing a silk dressing gown or looking in any way relaxed. He had simply removed his coat and cravat. He wore a crisp white linen shirt, the collar open, exposing the strong column of his throat, and dark trousers. He looked massive in the dim light of the bedroom, his presence eating up the oxygen in the room. In one hand, he carried 2 crystal glasses. In the other, a small decanter of amber liquid. He closed the door behind him and walked over to a small table near the fireplace, setting the glasses down. He poured a generous measure into both. "Brandy," he said, turning to look at her. She was still pressed against the window, her arms crossed tight over her chest, a physical barrier against him. "You look as though you are about to face a firing squad, Clara. Drink this." He held out a glass. She hesitated, then crossed the room slowly, keeping her eyes on the glass, avoiding his face. Her hand shook slightly as she took it from him. Their fingers brushed. His were incredibly warm. She took a sip. The brandy was harsh, burning a trail down her throat, but it immediately sent a rush of heat into her cold stomach. Arthur drank his in one swallow and set the glass down. He didn't move closer to her. He stood near the hearth, looking into the dying embers. "I am aware," he began, his voice low, lacking the clipped authority it had had at dinner, "that this is not the marriage you desired." Clara looked up at him, surprised by the admission. "It is the marriage I have, Your Grace." "Arthur," he corrected softly. "When we are alone, you will call me Arthur. I will not have titles between us in a bedroom. Arthur." Then she turned her head to look at him. The moonlight caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone. "Your father's debts were substantial," he said. "The men he owed were not gentlemen. They were preparing to take things much more valuable than his property to settle the score. I stepped in because the Danvers name is too old to be dragged through that particular mud, and because I needed a wife. A mutually beneficial arrangement," she said bitterly. "Yes." He took a step toward her. Clara immediately took a step back, her shoulders hitting the heavy wooden bedpost. She couldn't help it. The flinch was instinctual. Arthur stopped instantly. He looked at her hands, still clutching the empty brandy glass so tightly her knuckles were white. He looked at her posture, stiff and braced for impact. He saw the sheer, unadulterated dread in her eyes. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away. "Just do it," she screamed in her mind. "Just throw me on the bed and get it over with. Don't look at me like a wounded animal." She felt the warmth of him as he stepped closer. She squeezed her eyes tighter, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She braced for the rough grab of his hands, for the tearing of cotton, for the painful, humiliating submission. He reached out. His hand touched her shoulder, but it wasn't a grab. It was a weight, a warm, heavy, incredibly gentle weight resting on her collarbone. Clara gasped, a tiny sound of shock, but she didn't open her eyes. Arthur's thumb moved just a fraction, brushing lightly against the fabric of her nightgown over her collarbone. The touch was so painfully careful it made her throat ache. He didn't pull her. He didn't push her toward the mattress. He simply stood there, his hand resting on her shoulder, grounding her in the space between them. Then his voice broke the silence. It was barely above a whisper, rough and startlingly vulnerable. "May I continue?" Clara's eyes snapped open. She looked up at him. Arthur was staring down at her. The cold, pragmatic Duke, the man who treated life like a ledger, was looking at her not as a debt collected, but as a human being. He was asking for permission. He had had every legal right to toss her onto the bed and do as he pleased. The law of England said she was his. The church said she was his. Her father had sold her to him, but Arthur Pendleton was standing in the dim light of their wedding night, his hand resting gently on her shaking shoulder, waiting for a sign, waiting for her consent. If she said no, she realized, with a sudden crashing wave of clarity, he would take his hand away. He would turn around and walk out the door. The transaction was dead. The ledger was closed. Clara looked into those pale grey eyes, and for the first time since she had walked down the aisle, the ice around her cynical heart cracked. She swallowed hard, the last burn of the brandy fading in her throat. She looked at his large hand on her shoulder, feeling the steady heat of it. She took a slow, trembling breath and held his gaze. "Yes," she whispered, "you may." The bed was empty when Clara awoke. She turned her head against the heavy linen pillowcase. The space beside her was cool to the touch, the indentation on the mattress the only proof that Arthur had been there at all. The fire had died completely, leaving the massive stone room biting cold. Clara lay still, staring up at the velvet canopy. She took a mental inventory of her body, her mind, her reality. There was no pain, no lingering humiliation. The wedding night had not been a sudden, miraculous explosion of passion. She was far too cynical to expect such nonsense, and Arthur was far too grounded to attempt it. Instead, it had been a quiet, careful dismantling of her dread. He had been exactly as he promised, deliberate, watchful, and intensely present. He had not closed his eyes and pretended she was someone else, and he had not rushed. He had treated her with a startling, sobering reverence, reading her rigid posture, pausing when she tensed, moving only when she exhaled. He hadn't said, "I love you." He had said, "Are you all right?" To Clara, the latter was infinitely more valuable. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Martha slipped into the room, a heavy scuttle of coal in one hand and a steaming pitcher in the other. "Good morning, Your Grace," the maid said, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She moved quickly to the hearth, kneeling to coax the embers back to life. "Good morning, Martha. What time is it?" "8, Your Grace. The Duke has been out since 6. He rode down to the lower tenant farms. The frost took a toll on the winter wheat. Clara sat up, pulling the thick quilts around her shoulders. Her father would not have known if a frost killed his crops, unless a steward handed him a piece of paper demanding money. Arthur was out in the dirt before sunrise. "Did he say when he would return?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "He left word with Mrs. Croft that you were not to be disturbed and that he would see you at luncheon." Martha poured hot water into the porcelain basin on the washstand. "He also left this on the vanity, Your Grace." Clara slipped out of bed. The floorboards were like ice against her bare feet. She crossed the room to the dark oak vanity. Sitting beside her silver-backed hairbrush was a small, folded piece of thick parchment. She opened it. The handwriting was sharp, black, and economical. No flourishes. "The southern rooms are drafty despite my instructions. I have ordered the fires kept high. Do not hesitate to command the staff. This house is yours to run. A. It was not a love letter. It was an operational directive." Clara read it twice. A strange, tight feeling bloomed in her chest. "This house is yours to run." An hour later, dressed in a practical gown of dark green wool, Clara descended the main staircase. The hall was silent, echoing with the ticking of a massive grandfather clock. She found Mrs. Croft in the morning room, aggressively reviewing a stack of butcher's bills. The housekeeper stood immediately. "Your Grace, I trust your rooms were satisfactory." "They were quite cold, Mrs. Croft," Clara said evenly. She did not raise her voice, but she did not soften the statement either. Mrs. Croft blinked, clearly expecting a meek, polite denial. "I apologize, Your Grace. The wind shifts off the moors in November. I will have the footman double the coal rations." "Thank you." Clara stepped further into the room. her eyes landing on the scattered bills. "You are doing the household accounts?" "Just the weekly tallies, Your Grace. The Duke prefers strict oversight." Clara moved to the table. For the last 4 years, her entire existence had been defined by staving off butchers, bakers, and tailors who screamed for unpaid debts. She knew the cost of mutton down to the farthing. She knew how much wax a household burned in a week. She picked up the butcher's tally. She scanned the column of numbers. 2 shillings a pound for salted beef, Clara murmured, frowning. "That is highway robbery. Even in London, in the dead of winter, it does not exceed 1/6. Mrs. Croft stiffened. "Mr. Higgins has supplied Ashbourne Hall for 20 years, Your Grace." "Then Mr. Higgins has been robbing Ashbourne Hall for a very long time." Clara dropped the paper back onto the desk. She looked directly at the older woman. "Arthur, the Duke, may have infinite resources, Mrs. Croft, but I have spent my adult life managing a household teetering on the edge of ruin. I will not tolerate waste. Send word to Mr. Higgins. Tell him the Duchess finds his prices insulting. If he does not lower them to 1/4, we will slaughter our own cattle and salt the meat ourselves." Mrs. Croft stared at her for a long, silent moment. The battle lines were drawn, the old guard assessing the new blood. Clara held her ground, her chin raised, her expression utterly flat. She would not be a ghost in this house. She was bought and paid for. She might as well earn her keep. Slowly, the rigid line of Mrs. Croft's mouth softened. A faint, almost imperceptible gleam of respect appeared in the housekeeper's eyes. "Yes, Your Grace," Mrs. Croft said, dipping her head. "I will send the boy down to the village immediately." Luncheon was served in a smaller parlour off the main hall, overlooking a sprawling, unkempt garden. Arthur arrived exactly at noon. He smelled of horse sweat, leather, and biting wind. His boots were caked in grey mud. He stopped in the doorway, looking at Clara as she sat by the window. "You changed the butcher's contract," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara set her teacup down on the saucer. The porcelain clinked sharply. "I did. If you wish to overturn my decision, you may do so. The man was overcharging you by a staggering margin." Arthur walked into the room. He didn't sit. He poured himself a glass of ale from the sideboard and took a long drink. When he lowered the glass, he was watching her with that same intense, assessing gaze he had used at the altar. "Higgins stormed up to the estate office an hour ago," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. He was red in the face, said a London girl had no business dictating country prices. Clara tightened her grip on her napkin. She prepared for the reprimand. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him," Arthur said, setting the glass down, "that he was lucky you did not audit the last decade of his receipts, and that if he ever spoke disrespectfully of my wife again, I would cancel his lease." Clara's breath caught. She stared at him, entirely disarmed. Arthur pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. He reached for a slice of bread, tearing it with strong, dirty hands. He agreed to 1/3. "You saved me £30 a year in 5 minutes, Clara. I know numbers," she said quietly. "It was the only thing I was allowed to control in my father's house, how much we owed, how long we could hide it." Arthur stopped chewing. He looked at her, his pale eyes tracking the sudden vulnerability in her face. The cynical armor had cracked just for a second, revealing the exhausted woman underneath. "You are not hiding here," he said softly. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer a dramatic declaration. He simply stated a fact, grounding her in the present reality of the stone walls around them. Over the next 3 weeks, a rhythm established itself. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no poetry readings in the drawing room, no moonlit strolls. Winter had clamped down on Yorkshire with a vicious grip, freezing the ground solid and turning the sky the color of bruised iron. But there was a different kind of intimacy blooming between them, the intimacy of shared labor. Clara practically took over the estate office. She found Arthur buried under a mountain of tenant requests and crop yield projections one afternoon, and without asking permission, pulled a chair up to the opposite side of his massive oak desk. She took half the stack. At first he had watched her, wary and silent, but when she efficiently cross-referenced a grain shortage with a secondary supplier in a neighboring county, saving him a week of travel, he had simply handed her the inkwell. They worked in companionable silence for hours. The scratch of their quills became a shared heartbeat. Clara realized with a slow, creeping sense of awe that Arthur Pendleton was not merely a duke. He was the linchpin holding thousands of lives together. When a roof collapsed in the village, Arthur paid for the timber. When a fever swept through the dairy farms, Arthur rode out with the physician, risking his own health to ensure the quarantine was managed properly. He was a good man, not a charming one, not a soft one, but a profoundly good one. One evening, deep into December, they were in the study. The wind was howling outside, rattling the heavy glass panes. Clara was rubbing her temples, staring at a ledger detailing the coal consumption of the tenant cottages. "Your eyes are strained," Arthur noted, not looking up from his own paperwork. "I am fine," she lied, blinking against the blurriness. Arthur set his pen down. He stood up, walking around the large desk. Clara tensed slightly, a residual reflex she hadn't quite unlearned. He stopped behind her chair. He didn't speak. He reached down, his large, warm hands settling on her shoulders. Clara went entirely still. His thumbs found the tight knots of tension at the base of her neck. He pressed down, hard and firm, massaging the aching muscles. A small, involuntary sigh escaped her lips. "You work too hard, Clara," he murmured, his voice rumbling near her ear. "I am merely matching your pace, Arthur. I am used to it. You are not." His fingers worked magic against her skin, drawing the cold and the stress out of her bones. "We have the capital to absorb the winter losses. You do not need to squeeze blood from stones." "It isn't about the money," she said softly, leaning her head back slightly against him, a terrifying concession of trust. "It is about the fact that it is ours. I want to protect it." His hands stilled. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and charged. Clara realized what she had said. Ours, not his, not her father's. Ours. Arthur slowly moved his hands from her shoulders, sliding them down her arms until his fingers caught hers. He pulled her gently to her feet, turning her around to face him. The pale winter moonlight caught his face. He looked at her with an intensity that made her chest ache. There was no hesitation now. The careful distance he had maintained since their wedding night was gone, replaced by a fierce, undeniable hunger. He lifted a hand, brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused from the rains and the freezing wind, but his touch was excruciatingly tender. "Clara," he breathed. He leaned down, and this time he didn't ask to continue. He knew the answer. His lips met hers. It wasn't the polite, dry kiss of the altar. It was deep, claiming, and desperate. Clara gasped, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his coat. She anchored herself against his solid warmth, kissing him back with a ferocity that surprised them both. All the cynical walls she had built over a lifetime of disappointment fractured and collapsed onto the Persian rug. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, lifting her slightly off the ground. She tasted of ink and tea. He tasted of dark ale and winter air. It was real. It was messy. It was theirs. The sanctuary they had built was breached 2 days before Christmas. Clara was in the greenhouse, instructing the head gardener on which winter blooms she wanted brought into the main hall, when a footman arrived breathless. "Your Grace, a carriage has arrived from London. It's Lady Agatha." Clara's stomach plummeted. Lady Agatha was Arthur's aunt on his mother's side. She was a woman who possessed 3 enormous estates, a terrifying underbite, and a tongue that had ruined reputations from Mayfair to Bath. Clara had met her exactly once, at a brief, disastrous dinner before the wedding, where Agatha had spent 2 hours loudly lamenting the deterioration of the Pendleton bloodline. "Where is the Duke?" Clara asked, stripping off her gardening gloves. "At the far lumber mill, Your Grace. He is not expected back until dusk." Clara squared her shoulders. "Very well. Prepare the blue guest suite. I will receive her in the drawing room." She did not bother to change her gown. She brushed the dirt from her skirts, washed her hands in a basin, and walked into the lion's den. Lady Agatha was standing in the center of the drawing room, inspecting a priceless Ming vase through a gold-rimmed lorgnette. She turned as Clara entered. She was swathed in expensive purple silk and an excessive amount of mink. "So," Agatha barked, her voice like grinding gears. "You are still here." "Welcome to Ashbourne, Lady Agatha," Clara said, her voice perfectly level. "A masterclass in aristocratic apathy. May I offer you tea after your long journey?" "I do not drink tea poured by the daughter of a common card sharp," Agatha sneered, dropping her lorgnette. She stalked toward Clara, her eyes raking over Clara's plain day dress. "Look at you. You look like a governess. Arthur is a fool. He paid £70,000 to bail your wretched father out of a gutter, and he didn't even get a woman who knows how to dress the part of a duchess." Clara felt the familiar, icy spike of shame in her chest. Her father's sins were a ghost that would never stop haunting her, but she was no longer the terrified girl cowering in a London townhouse, waiting for the bailiffs. She was the woman who argued down the butcher, who audited the coal ledgers, who shared a bed with the Duke of Ashbourne. "My father's debts are his own, Lady Agatha," Clara said smoothly, "and my wardrobe is entirely Arthur's business. If you have come to insult me, you have succeeded. Now, if you will excuse me, I have an estate to run." "You run nothing," Agatha snapped, her face flushing an ugly mottled red. "You are a purchased broodmare girl. Do not put on airs with me. Once you give him a son, he will banish you to the dower house and take a mistress in London, just like every sensible man of his station." "Is that so?" The voice came from the doorway. It was quiet. It was lethal. Clara and Agatha both whipped around. Arthur stood there. He was still in his riding leathers, his greatcoat dripping melting snow onto the polished hardwood floor. He looked massive, dark, and utterly furious. "Arthur, darling boy," Agatha said, her tone instantly sweetening into something sickly and cloying. I heard exactly what you were doing, Aunt." Arthur interrupted, stepping into the room. He didn't look at Agatha. His eyes locked onto Clara, scanning her face for damage. When he saw she was unhurt, his gaze snapped back to his aunt. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You will apologize to my wife," Arthur said. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by smooth, hard ice. Agatha blinked, genuinely shocked. "Arthur, do not be absurd. I am your aunt. She is, well, we all know what she is. She is the Duchess of Ashbourne," Arthur said, taking a slow, menacing step toward the older woman. "She is the mistress of this house, and she is my wife. You will speak to her with the respect her title and her position demand, or you will find yourself back in your carriage before the horses have even been unhitched." Agatha gasped, clutching her mink coat to her chest. "You would throw your own blood out into the snow for this transaction?" Arthur finally moved to Clara's side. He didn't hesitate. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his long, calloused fingers through hers. He held on tight, presenting a unified, impenetrable front. "She is not a transaction, Agatha," Arthur said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "She is my partner, and she is worth 10 of you. Apologize, now." The silence was deafening. Agatha stared at Arthur's hand holding Clara's. She saw the immovable resolve in her nephew's pale eyes. She saw the quiet, terrifying strength in Clara's rigid posture. The old woman swallowed hard. The cruelty drained out of her face, leaving only a bitter, humiliated defeat. I misspoke," Agatha ground out, refusing to look at Clara. "I apologize." "Pack your bags," Arthur said flatly. "You are leaving." "Arthur, the roads are clear enough for a rapid departure. Mrs. Croft will see you out." Arthur didn't wait for her to respond. He turned his back on his aunt, still holding Clara's hand, and walked her out of the drawing room. He led her down the long, echoing corridor, not stopping until they reached the heavy oak doors of his private study. He pulled her inside and shut the door firmly behind them, dropping the latch with a sharp click. They stood in the quiet room, surrounded by the smell of leather-bound books and wood smoke. Arthur let go of her hand. He took off his wet greatcoat, throwing it carelessly over a chair. He ran a hand through his damp, dark hair. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscle jumped. Clara watched him. Her heart was hammering a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. He had defended her, not because he owned her, but because he valued her. He had humiliated his own powerful bloodline to protect her dignity. "Arthur," she whispered. He stopped pacing. He turned to look at her, the residual anger still burning in his grey eyes. "She was wrong," Arthur said, his voice rough. He crossed the room, stopping inches from her. "I did not buy a broodmare. I did not buy property." He reached up, cupping her face in his large, warm hands. His thumbs stroked across her cheekbones. "I found a woman who knows the exact price of salted beef and refuses to back down to anyone," he murmured, the anger fading, replaced by something deep and agonizingly raw. "I found a woman who took this cold, empty stone box and made it breathe again." "I found you, Clara." Clara closed her eyes. A single, hot tear escaped and slid over his thumb. It was the first time she had cried since the day she learned her father was ruined. It wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was the physical shattering of the last stubborn piece of ice around her heart. "I am not going to banish you to a dower house," Arthur whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. "I am never going to let you go. You are mine, Clara, and I am yours, fully, irrevocably." Clara opened her eyes, looking into the pale winter sky of his gaze. There was no ledger between them anymore. No debts, no transactions, just a man and a woman standing in the ruins of their cynical pasts, building something unbreakable from the ground up. Then let her leave, Clara said softly, a small, genuine smile curving her lips. We have ledgers to balance, Arthur. He laughed, a low, genuine sound that vibrated against her chest, and pulled her into his arms, kissing her until the memory of London, of debts, and of cold wedding nights vanished entirely, leaving only the warmth of the fire and the undeniable truth of a forced marriage that had accidentally, wonderfully, become everything they both needed. Spring did not arrive in Yorkshire with a gentle scattering of snowdrops and a warming breeze. It arrived violently. The frozen earth cracked open, turning the sprawling moors and the estate roads into a thick, sucking quagmire of grey mud. The skies wept incessantly, a cold, driving rain that rattled the leaded glass of Ashbourne Hall and turned the stone corridors damp. Clara loved it. She loved the raw, unfiltered reality of the season. In London, spring meant the start of the season, a grueling, artificial marathon of ballrooms, forced smiles, and desperate calculations. Here, spring meant survival. It meant the lambing season. It meant the frantic rush to sow the barley before the fields flooded. It meant the brutal, honest labor of keeping 300 tenants alive and solvent. She was no longer the frightened bride, clutching a brandy glass in the dark. Clara wore heavy woolen dresses, hemmed 3 inches above her ankles to avoid the mud. She wore sturdy leather boots. She commanded the household staff with a quiet, unyielding authority that even Mrs. Croft had come to revere. The ledger she had once viewed as a symbol of her servitude was now her weapon. One Tuesday in late April, the rain was coming down in grey sheets. Clara sat at the massive desk in the estate office, a smudge of ink on her chin, cross-referencing the seed grain purchases. The fire roared in the hearth, throwing heat against the chill. The heavy oak door swung open. Arthur stepped inside. He looked entirely ragged. His heavy riding coat was soaked through, dripping a puddle onto the floorboards. His boots were caked in clay. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and a profound exhaustion lined his face. He had been up since 3 in the morning, helping the veterinary surgeon pull a breached foal from one of the prized carriage mares. Clara immediately set her quill down. She didn't ask how it went. She looked at his hands, slick with rain and blood.
"Martha,"
Clara called, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise of the storm. The maid appeared instantly from the adjoining hallway. Hot water, towels, and the whiskey, immediately. Clara stood up and crossed the room. She didn't flinch from the dirt or the smell of livestock clinging to him. She reached up and began working the heavy, wet buttons of his coat. Arthur stood perfectly still, letting her strip the sodden wool from his shoulders. He looked down at her, his pale grey eyes heavy. "The mare lived," he rasped, his voice raw from shouting over the wind. "The foal did not. I am sorry, Arthur," she said quietly. She pulled the coat free and tossed it onto a wooden chair near the fire. She took his cold, muddy hands in hers, ignoring the grime that transferred to her pale skin. He leaned his forehead against hers. He didn't need to posture. He didn't need to pretend he wasn't gutted by the loss of the animal he had spent all night trying to save. With Clara, the armor was entirely gone. "You are shivering," she murmured. "I am covered in filth. I am ruining your dress." "It is only wool," she said, pulling him slightly closer. "It washes." This was their romance. It wasn't built on sonnets or grand, sweeping declarations. It was built on hot water and whiskey after a brutal night. It was built on the silent, absolute certainty that when one of them faltered, the other would stand firm. Martha hurried in with the basin and a heavy linen towel. Clara dismissed her with a nod. She poured a measure of whiskey, handing the glass to Arthur. He drank it in one long, burning swallow. As Clara took the hot towel and began to wipe the dried blood and mud from his hands, the deep, resonant chime of the front doorbell echoed through the manor. Arthur frowned, looking toward the hallway. Who the hell is traveling in this downpour? Footsteps hurried across the marble foyer. The low murmur of the butler's voice drifted down the corridor, followed by a sharper, higher-pitched response. Clara froze. The towel slipped from her grasp, landing softly on the floorboards. She knew that voice. She had spent 24 years listening to that voice rationalize debts, dismiss creditors, and lie with the smooth, practiced ease of a born gambler. "Clara?" Arthur asked, instantly alert. The exhaustion vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. He saw the color drain completely from her face. "It is my father," she whispered. Her heart began to hammer a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. Lord Richard Danvers had not written a single letter since the day he placed her in Arthur's carriage. He had taken his £70,000 and vanished back into the velvet-draped gaming hells of St. James. His presence here, in the brutal mud of Yorkshire, meant only one thing. The money was gone. "Stay here," Arthur said. His voice was no longer the exhausted murmur of a farmer. It was the chilling, authoritative command of the Duke of Ashbourne. He turned toward the door, his jaw locked. Clara reached out and grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "No," she said. She forced oxygen into her lungs. The terrified girl from London tried to claw her way back to the surface, screaming at her to hide, to let Arthur handle the monster. But Clara looked at the ledgers on her desk. She looked at the fire she had ordered built. She felt the heavy gold band on her left hand. This was her house. "No," she repeated, her voice steadying. She let go of his arm and squared her shoulders. "He is my father. He is my ghost. I will see him." Arthur studied her face for a long, tense second. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, but he also saw the iron resolve underneath it. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute respect. "I will be right behind you," he said. Lord Richard Danvers stood in the center of the grand drawing room, looking entirely out of place. He was dressed in the height of London fashion, a tailored coat of dark blue superfine, a meticulously tied cravat, and polished hessians that were currently dripping grey Yorkshire mud onto Mrs. Croft's immaculate Persian rug. But the clothes could not hide the truth. His skin was sallow. His hands, gripping a silver-topped walking stick, trembled slightly. He looked frantic. He spun around as the heavy double doors opened. Clara walked in. She did not wear silk or pearls. She wore her practical dark wool, the hem stained with mud, her hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense knot. Danvers blinked, clearly taken aback. He had expected the quiet, obedient daughter he had sold. He was faced with the Duchess of Ashbourne. Arthur stepped into the room a second later. He stood near the door, leaning his broad shoulder against the heavy oak frame. He made no move to greet his father-in-law. He simply watched, his pale eyes entirely dead, his presence a silent, looming threat. "Clara," Danvers said, forcing a broad, desperate smile. He took a step forward, his arms opening. "My dear girl, you look well. The country agrees with you." Clara did not move. She did not return the smile. "Why are you here, father?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. Danvers let his arms drop, the smile fracturing. He shot a nervous glance at Arthur, then back to Clara. Is that any way to greet your own flesh and blood? I have traveled for 3 days through an infernal storm to see my only child. You traveled for 3 days because you are running from something, Clara stated. She walked slowly toward the fireplace, putting physical distance between them, or running toward something, namely Arthur's vault. Which is it? Danvers's face flushed a dull, ugly red. You are insolent. I see your new station has given you ideas above your breeding. My station gave me exactly what you sold me for. Clara shot back, her tone dropping a register. Speak plainly, father. We have an estate to run, and your boots are ruining the rug. Danvers gripped his walking stick tighter. The charming facade crumbled completely, revealing the panicked, desperate addict underneath. I need £20,000, he blurted out. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second. A bitter, hollow laugh threatened to bubble up in her throat. £20,000. It was a staggering sum, a sum that could build a hospital or feed an entire village for a decade. He had likely lost it on the turn of a single card. No, she said. Danvers stared at her. What? No, Clara repeated, opening her eyes. She looked at him with an icy detachment that she hadn't known she possessed. You will not see a single penny from this house. Danvers took a menacing step toward her. You ungrateful little wretch. I gave you this life. I secured this marriage for you. Without me, you would be a spinster rotting in a debtor's prison. You owe me. I owe you nothing. Clara's voice cracked like a whip in the large room. The repressed anger of 24 years finally shattered its restraints. She stepped forward, closing the distance, her eyes blazing. You did not secure a marriage. You arranged a liquidation. You sold me to clear your ledger. You placed a price on my head, took the money, and walked away. The transaction is complete, Lord Danvers. You have no further line of credit here. Danvers sneered. He realized he could not bully her. He pivoted, turning his desperate gaze toward the man leaning against the doorframe. Your Grace, Danvers pleaded, shifting his tone to one of gentlemanly solidarity. Surely you can see reason. A man of your vast wealth, 20,000 is a drop in the ocean. If I default, the scandal will reach your door. Your wife's name will be dragged through the mud. Arthur did not push off the doorframe. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Danvers with the cold, detached interest of a man watching an insect drown. My wife's name is Pendleton, Arthur said smoothly. Her reputation is entirely secure. Be reasonable, Ashbourne. Danvers's voice cracked. Panic was setting in. The men I owe are not gentlemen. They will come for me. Then I suggest you run, Arthur replied. You cannot let them kill me, Danvers screamed, abandoning all pretense of dignity. He looked wildly between Arthur and Clara. Arthur finally moved. He pushed off the doorframe and took 2 slow, measured steps into the room. The sheer physical size of him seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. I do not manage the charity of this estate, Lord Danvers, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. I suggest you appeal to the mistress of the house, though I believe she has already given you her answer. He looked at Clara. It was the ultimate relinquishment of power. He was handing her the sword. He was telling her, in front of the man who had terrorized her entire life, that she was the absolute authority. Clara looked at her father. She saw a pathetic, broken man. She felt no pity. She felt only a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. There is a small cottage on the northern border of the Welsh property, Clara said, her voice dropping back to a cool, level calm. It has 2 rooms, a peat fire, and a garden. If you go there, my steward will provide you with food, basic clothing, and an allowance of 5 shillings a week. You will never set foot in London again. You will never touch a deck of cards again. If you leave the county, the allowance stops. Danvers stared at her in sheer horror. 5 shillings? A cottage? I am a lord of the realm. You are condemning me to live like a peasant. I am offering you a roof and a pulse, Clara said flatly. Take it, or walk out that door and face your creditors. The choice is yours. But know this, if you ever show your face at Ashbourne Hall again, I will have the gamekeepers shoot you for trespassing. Silence descended on the room. It was absolute and crushing. Danvers looked at his daughter. He searched her face for a trace of the weak, malleable girl he had manipulated for years. He found nothing but granite. He looked at Arthur, whose hand rested casually near the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. Danvers's shoulders slumped. The walking stick fell from his trembling hand, clattering loudly against the floorboards. He had lost. The final hand had been played, and he had nothing left to wager. I will take the carriage to Wales, he whispered, his voice entirely broken. No, Clara corrected, her tone devoid of mercy. You will take a mail coach. My footman will escort you to the village station. Goodbye, father. She turned her back on him. It was the most definitive gesture she had ever made. She walked to the window, looking out at the driving rain, and did not turn around until she heard the heavy drawing-room doors close, leaving her alone with her husband. The adrenaline left her blood so quickly, it felt like a physical blow. Clara stood by the window, staring blankly at the grey sheets of rain battering the glass. Her hands began to shake. The tremor started in her fingers and rapidly moved up her arms until her entire body was vibrating. She grabbed the heavy velvet curtains, gripping them tight enough to tear the fabric, desperately trying to anchor herself. She had done it. She had severed the rotting limb, but the phantom pain was agonizing. A heavy, warm weight settled over her shoulders. Arthur didn't say a word. He stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and pulled her back against his solid, unyielding chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. He smelled of rain, horses, and the faint, sharp tang of whiskey. She grabbed his forearms, her knuckles white, and squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't cry. She just leaned into him, absorbing his heat, letting his steady heartbeat drown out the chaotic ringing in her ears. He is gone, Arthur murmured, his breath warm against her skin. I gave Croft strict orders. The man is dead to this household. I was so afraid, she whispered, her voice fracturing in the quiet room. I know. I was afraid you would regress, that you would just hand him the keys to the vault to make him stop looking at you like that. Arthur tightened his grip, pulling her flush against him. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Clara. You stood in the mud today, and you built a fortress. He can never touch you again. She turned in his arms. She looked up at him. The exhaustion in his face mirrored her own, but his grey eyes were fiercely, intensely alive. There was no ledger anymore. There were no debts, no transactions, no ghosts of London haunting the corners of the room. There was only the brutal, honest reality of what they had forged in the cold Yorkshire winter. She reached up, her hands tangling in his damp hair. She pulled his mouth down to hers. The kiss was desperate, tasting of salt and survival. It was a claiming of space, a physical validation that they were here, they were alive, and they belonged to no one but each other. Arthur backed her against the heavy mahogany desk, sweeping a stack of agricultural reports to the floor with a careless sweep of his arm. He didn't ask to continue. The question was obsolete. The permission was absolute, etched into the very foundation of their marriage. Months passed. The spring mud dried, giving way to the brilliant, piercing green of a Yorkshire summer. The estate thrived. The butcher's bills remained fiercely contested. The tenant roofs were repaired, and the ledgers in the estate office were balanced with ruthless precision. Clara and Arthur moved through their days as a single, devastatingly effective unit. In late September, the harvest moon hung heavy and gold over the moors. The air had turned crisp, carrying the first faint warning of winter. Clara sat at her vanity in the southern chambers, brushing out her dark hair. The fire popped and hissed in the grate, throwing warm, dancing light across the room. She set the brush down and looked at her reflection. She was heavier now. Her face had lost its gaunt, cynical edge, replaced by a grounded, radiant health. She rested her hand on the slight swell of her stomach. It was an heir, or a spare, or a daughter. Society would care deeply about the distinction, but Clara knew Arthur did not. He had merely looked at her when the physician confirmed the news, his pale eyes entirely stripped of their formidable guard, and pressed his forehead against hers in silent, overwhelming relief. It was not a dynastic obligation fulfilled. It was an extension of their partnership. The heavy brass handle of the bedroom door turned. Arthur stepped in. He had shed his coat and cravat, his white linen shirt open at the collar. He looked exactly as he had on their wedding night, yet entirely different. The rigid, transactional Duke was gone. This was simply her husband. He crossed the room, carrying 2 crystal glasses of amber liquid. He set one down on the vanity in front of her. "You cannot drink it," he noted, a faint, teasing smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "But I poured it for the ceremony." Clara smiled, a genuine, easy expression that reached her eyes. She picked up the glass and inhaled the sharp scent of the brandy, letting the memory wash over her. It no longer sparked dread. It sparked a profound sense of gratitude. Arthur stepped behind her. He placed his large, warm hands on her shoulders. Clara looked at him in the mirror. He caught her gaze in the reflection. His thumbs moved, tracing the delicate line of her collarbone, a deliberate, tender echo of the very first time he had touched her. "I was reviewing the winter cold projections today," Arthur murmured, leaning down so his cheek brushed against her hair. "And?" she asked softly. "And I realized you approved a 5% increase for the tenant cottages without consulting me." Clara leaned back into his solid warmth. "They need it, Arthur. The frost will be harsh this year." "I am not arguing with the decision, Duchess," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "I am merely pointing out that you are spending my money with alarming ease." "It is our money," she corrected, turning her head to press a kiss to his jaw. Arthur's hands slid down from her shoulders, wrapping around her waist, his large palms resting gently over her stomach. He held her there, fiercely protective, intensely present. He looked at her in the mirror, his grey eyes dark with an emotion that needed no poetry to explain. It was solid. It was real. "Clara," he whispered into the quiet room. She turned in her chair, facing him, looking up into the face of the man who had bought her debts and given her a life. "Yes?" she asked. He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing gently across her lower lip, a slow, deeply human smile broke across his face. May I stay? Clara reached up, covering his rough hand with hers, pressing it tightly against her cheek. The ledger was closed forever. The night was entirely theirs. Always, she said,